Welcome to DBS Discussions, Safeguarding in Focus, where we'll be joined by experts from across the disclosure and barring service, and in this series, guests from a range of external organisations to explore the issues that matter in safeguarding. With guests from organisations such as the NSPCC, and Craft Trust and Unlock, alongside colleagues from DBS, each episode brings you insights, expert perspectives and practical guidance to support safer recruitment and safer practice. Whether you're an employer, a safeguarding lead, or simply want to understand more about how DBS works, you're in the right place. Welcome to episode 3 in the second series of Safeguarding Discussions, DBS in Focus. I'm Hayley Kay, an independent podcast host, and in this episode, we'll look again at levels of DBS checks and safeguarding, but this time we'll be looking specifically at working with adults. Today, my guests are Bethany Culshaw, DBS Policy Advisor, alongside Cath Sykes from Craft Trust, who's a Safeguarding Adults Manager for the sports and activity sector. So, welcome both. Cath, if it's okay to start with you, let's begin then with organisations generally then. When they're recruiting for people to work with adults, what should they be considering?
Well, I think any organisation, it's really important that we select the right person for the job. That's our ultimate aim, is to make sure that we recruit effectively, select the right person for the role. And I know sometimes budgets can be squeezed and we're all working with limited capacity, but that doesn't mean safeguarding standards need to slip in this situation. So some of the considerations that organisations need to think about is firstly, really define who are they working with, what are the groups of adults that they're working with, where are they working with them, how are they working with them? Because once we begin to understand this sort of fundamental element, we can start putting the safeguarding recruitment processes in place to support that. So some of the things we need to consider is about how we advertise for the role, the steps we put in place to make sure we get the right people applying for the job. So it's really spelling out exactly what they'll be doing within that role, and making sure that we have those safe recruitment processes sort of tied in with that as well. So it might be, as I said, the job advert, the way we select people, the application process. DBS might be an element of that as well. It's the references that we might be obtaining. It's the interview process, the selection process. So it's really seeing it all the way through. And then afterwards, it's going on to the induction and supervision and sort of taking it onwards from there.
Thanks, Cath. So much to consider there at that stage. And you mentioned DBS being part of that wider safeguarding decision-making process. Bethany, if I could ask you then to sort of join us by talking about eligibility for the checks and why it's important.
Yes, of course. Eligibility for standard and enhanced DBS checks is controlled by the law. So we have certain legal criteria that has to be met depending upon what type of check you're going for. So whether you're applying for a standard DBS check, an enhanced DBS check, or an enhanced DBS check with barred list checks. When we're looking at eligibility, we encourage employers to assess the activities that the roles are carrying out, rather than specifically looking at the job title. We know that job titles are very subjective from organisation to organisation, so they can mean different things to different people. So we're looking at the activities that are being carried out and then assessing those against the legal criteria to work out what level of check is appropriate. When organisations are recruiting individuals to work with adults, there are two differing sets of criteria for them to look at. In the main, these individuals are going to be working with adults in roles that are going to be eligible for enhanced DBS checks or enhanced with barred list checks.
Okay.
And one of the biggest things that we would always encourage employers to look at is to look at the adults that these recruited individuals are going to be working with. These two different sets of criteria are a legal definition of what is work with adults. And then we have regulated activity with adults, which is something which is very well known about within the recruitment sphere. Work with adults the eligibility is based around whether adults fall into a set group of criteria. Whereas regulated activity with adults, you can be carrying out regulated activity with adults. Those adults can be anybody. They are you, they are me, everybody that sets foot into a doctor's surgery or a dentist's surgery or goes to see an osteopath even. That is the criteria that we are looking at when we're talking about the groups of adults that employers need to look at.
Gosh, so there's real sort of, I think you said in the introduction there that it's sort of set out by law, and the detail actually is in not the job title, it's in that what is expected in your role, what you will be doing specifically in your day-to-day role.
Yes, that's correct. So we know that employers they struggle with establishing eligibility. And specifically, it's because the eligibility criteria is based off of what the job is doing. And a lot of the time, it's more than just what they're doing. It's what they're doing, who they're working with, how often they're doing it. It goes into an awful lot of detail. With regulated activity with adults, it's almost an easier way to establish things because the activities are very, very specific, but they can be done for anybody who is over the age of 18.
Can you give us an example of a regulated activity?
Yes, it's very easy. So a very, very easy example would be your GP.
Okay.
So your GP is providing healthcare. They are also a regulated healthcare professional, and they are providing healthcare to adults just once. That's the only kind of regularity criteria that needs to be met there.
Got it. Okay. You both mentioned about working with adults. We've mentioned vulnerable adults, and we hear that term quite a lot, and adults at risk. So who are we talking about when these terms get mentioned?
From a DBS perspective, we know that the public use this term vulnerable. There's no legal definition of what makes somebody a vulnerable adult.
Wow.
So we don't have a tick list as such. We know that people can be vulnerable for many different reasons. It can be to do with health conditions. It can be to do with their age. It could also be to do with the fact that they don't speak English or they are bereaved. There's many different elements of being a vulnerable individual. From a DBS perspective, if you are in receipt of a regulated activity, then you are vulnerable at that point and you are a vulnerable adult. However, that's not because you've hit a tick list of living in a certain place or being a certain age or having a certain illness. It's about the fact that you are there at your GP surgery receiving advice about your health from a regulated healthcare professional.
Gosh, okay. There are, I don't know, I honestly thought there would be like a specific definition of what is a vulnerable adult, but then it got me thinking that there's times in everyone's life where you'll feel vulnerable. As you said, when you feel bereaved, you feel vulnerable. When you've just had a baby, you feel very vulnerable. So yeah, I guess I'd never really thought about it like that. Cath, can I ask you, the work that you do at Ancras Trust, I'm just more interested in how you help with this process, because just in our very short chat so far, there's a lot to consider.
There certainly is, and the conversation has really evolved from originally when we were talking about the term vulnerable adult, and specifically sort of following on from what Bethany has said. It doesn't necessarily relate to the person's characteristics, but it's the circumstances that they can find themselves, which could lead for some people to be in that more vulnerable situation. Doesn't mean it's a permanent situation. People can move in and out of that sort of phase of vulnerability. And so we just need to make sure we've got safeguarding measures in place to support those people. And they can take many forms. So within the Ancras Trust, we really focus on supporting organisations to recognise that they have that responsibility to safeguard all the adults who might participate in their activities or access their services. That doesn't mean to say that all those adults are going to need safeguarding support or intervention, but it's there should they require it. And if they do require it, there's different ways that we can support those adults. So not all of them will need sort of referral onto statutory agencies. With the right signposting support, having those conversations with the adult, they might be able to sort of access the support themselves. So there's a different way that we can support them with that so that they can continue to use our activities. But there will be some people, and this is where the Care Act definition comes in, and that's where we sort of move towards that definition of an adult at risk. And actually, it's a very small proportion of the population when you think of what the population is of the UK. And the definition of an adult at risk is somebody who's over the age of 18, has care and support needs, whether or not they're being taken care of by the local authority, but they cannot protect themselves. So when we're thinking about safeguarding, we've got that layered approach. So for those people, it's crucial that they can access that support, and rightly so, from the statutory agencies, because we've got to make sure we've got those mechanisms in place. But for everybody else, we also need to make sure that they know where they can access the relevant support from to enable them to move to a better situation that they might be able to find themselves in.
And I guess that is what you do at Ancraft Trust, is help organisations with advice when it comes to safeguarding adults, because it doesn't feel very straightforward.
It isn't. It's grey. Safeguarding's never black and white, and we cannot do it in isolation. We have to be working together. Just even thinking about safeguarding adults, and there's 10 categories of abuse for adults. It might be financial abuse, it might be domestic abuse, it might be discriminatory. So we can't be expected to have all of the answers, which is why we have to work in collaboration and bring in partners to help us sort of help the individuals through these situations. And sort of just to give a bit of an example of that, when we're talking about the situations that people can find themselves, particularly in lockdown, we heard that there was an increase, a rise in the number of reports made about domestic abuse. And that was purely because of the circumstances that people found themselves in, that they were confined to those homes and those situations. So it's sort of preparing for that. So just because somebody doesn't meet that definition of an adult at risk doesn't mean to say that we can't support them in some way.
So, Cath, I'm going to ask you actually again, if you don't mind, what other things would you advise considering them when safeguarding adults? Because we've gone through a lot already, but when you've said there's like 10 categories of abuse, I was shocked. So it feels like there's a whole range to be covered on this topic.
There is a lot to understand, I think, particularly for those who might be quite sort of new and developing their policies. It is really about understanding, educating and raising that awareness so you can understand how to build your policy and your procedures on that. So starting with the Care Act, sort of looking at the different elements within that. So it's making safeguarding personal, looking at the 6 key principles, and wellbeing plays such an important role in that. And although it's specifically for the statutory sector, there's so much learning that we can all take from this and use in our day-to-day practice. We get a lot of inquiries come in to the Ancraft Trust to help us sort of navigate this field and understand what organisations need to have in place. And it has to be, there isn't one size fits all. It has to be really bespoke. Every organisation's different. They work differently. They employ their staff differently, have volunteers, etc. But one of the things they do come in to us for is for clarity over DBS checks and what should they be doing, because the vast majority of people want to be doing the right thing. They want to be working with people to keep them safe. They want to be providing the best possible service. So sometimes they can be overcautious and want to be doing more than they perhaps should be doing. So in these situations, it's really positive, the relationship we have with the DBS, because we can signpost. We are not the experts at the Ancraft Trust in the DBS field. We know what we're good at, and that's why we always pass over to the DBS, because it is complicated.
So what's your take on all that, Bethany? Because it seems like, you know, DBS has a huge role to play, but there is like people are nervous, aren't they, or perhaps a bit unsure about maybe what level of check or where to start.
Yes, absolutely. And I completely agree with Cath's point that organisations, they're just desperate to do the right thing. They're desperate to do the right thing for the users of their service, but also to protect themselves. We are currently in quite a risk-averse society. So organisations want to make sure that they are doing their best for themselves as well as for their users. I completely understand that it is a complex field. One of the key things that organisations should be aware of is the fact that working with children, the eligibility criteria is very different to working with adults. So it isn't that if you are somebody who teaches children, the same level of DBS check applies if you are teaching adults. It doesn't work like that. Just to throw a little bit more of a spanner in the works.
No, but see, all that is useful to know, because I would assume that, but actually, no, that's not the case. Why isn't that the case? Is it just because the two things are so different?
It's because the definition of regulated activity with adults doesn't include that teaching, training, instruction activity. However, and I touched on this slightly before, we've got this legislative definition of work with adults, and this is where we are looking at where the adults fall within a set of criteria that the individual is going to be working with. And we're looking at adults who are either living in specific accommodation that they require because of healthcare or support that they need, like a care home or sheltered housing, or they're receiving a specific service relating to healthcare or support that they need. So maybe they're in detention, or maybe they are released on licence. It could also cover adults who receive direct payments, either from their NHS trust or from their local authority as well. So those adults, that's what we would then say, if your role is going to be working with adults that fall into that criteria, then we look at the activities. That's when teaching, training, instruction of adults would come in. But you then also have to be doing it on a specific number of times. So you have to be doing it on more than 3 days in any 30-day period, or once a week on an ongoing basis, which is kind of the same, or once overnight. And then there has to be the opportunity for contact with the adults. So that would apply if you're not necessarily for the teaching aspect, but for supervising or caring for, if you are somebody that works in a care home and you are on a night shift.
It's such a good job you're there to help people navigate, because I love that you've both said the same thing, and that is that by and large, everybody just wants to get this right, and we do live in a risk-averse society. And Bethany, can you talk to us a little bit more about the new legislation surrounding self-employed individuals and their access to checks?
Yes, of course. This is something that's quite new. It just came in January into legislation. So before January, if you were a self-employed individual who was carrying out eligible work, you couldn't get your own enhanced DBS check. You had to be employed by somebody in order to get that, because they had to ask you to apply. This was a barrier. It was recognised as being a barrier, and specifically in relation to, in the adult sector, to personal assistance for individuals who receive direct payments. So in circumstances where an individual is given a direct payment budget by their NHS trust or their local authority, they can then become an employer and go out to recruit their own carer. They can set as much criteria as they like. And in the past, they couldn't access DBS checks for those individuals because those individuals were self-employed and couldn't get their own enhanced checks and enhanced checks with barless checks. Those rules have now changed. So these checks are available in those circumstances. It's not about a change to eligibility. It's only about the fact that they can now access the checks because they're carrying out the eligible work.
So how does that work then, essentially? So say you're a person that's in receipt of these care payments. You want to have a personal assistant because really they're doing personal work, essentially. So you've found someone, because essentially then that person becomes the employer, as you've sort of said. So would they just then be able to apply for the right level of check themselves?
So the carer, the person being employed, is able to apply to us directly, to DBS. The application still has to go through an organisation to get to us, but there's a set of criteria that they have to follow when they're submitting that application. There's very specific wording that they have to put in that application, and we have really extensive guidance around that on the website about how individuals can get their own checks in those specific circumstances.
I've made some notes also that I wanted to ask you about. How does this affect insurance, for example? I mean, is this? I don't know who's best play. Who wants to answer that? Sorry, I've just thrown that in. Bethany, come on, talk
That's
to
a
me
bit
about.
of a myth.
Oh,
that
really?
one. Yes. So it's something which we at DBS get asked about quite regularly, where buildings, organisations that rent out buildings, will have as part of their contract that the users of the buildings must have enhanced DBS checks or enhanced DBS checks with barred list checks. And they say within the contract that this is for insurance purposes, which it definitely isn't. So they can put in their contract that if you are carrying out eligible work, then you must make sure that the appropriate level of DBS check is carried out. That's absolutely fine. But to specify and the higher level of check is required is misleading, and it's putting organisations in a difficult position, because a contractual requirement can't trump the fact that the legislative criteria has to be met, and if it isn't, then they would be breaching that. And another big, very wide misconception is that you need a DBS check because you have contact with these people, with adults, with vulnerable adults in inverted commas. The actual contact is something that we all have. We all have on a day-to-day basis. We have it every single time we go into a supermarket, every single time we sit next to somebody on a bus. We potentially are having that contact. The eligibility is specific to what you're actually carrying out as part of your job for that person, rather than just having contact with them. So we see a lot of queries about people who are part of community groups, particularly, where, because the group is uncertain about what is appropriate, they carry out the highest possible level check across the board for everybody who works for them, regardless of what they're actually doing for the users of that group. That's definitely something which we understand is a concern, but is not something that can necessarily be addressed by using DBS checks. It's, as Cath said earlier, it's about the ongoing supervision of those people in their roles by the organisation that will help with the safeguarding in that aspect.
And that's something else we see regularly with the Ancraft Trust, particularly within the sport and physical activity environment, and the ageing population at the moment. There's this big, through Sport England and the Uniting the Movement agenda. It's really to encourage adults and the more elderly people to engage in physical activity. And as we do that, not everybody will be eligible to have the DBS check, which is why it's so important to have other mechanisms in place, whether it's the code of conducts that you might have, up-to-date training of your volunteers and your staff to support people, so we can really create that safe environment for people to be able to participate in physical activity.
And sort of through no fault of their own. The legislation is there, and there's nothing that, doesn't matter how nicely you ask, it's this doesn't meet the criteria, then it's a flat no.
Absolutely.
Before we finish the episode, you've both touched on the Care Act, and I will read a little section of it. Protecting an adult's right to live in safety, free from abuse and neglect. So could I ask you both, and I think I'll ask Cath to go first this time, could I ask you both just to give some final considerations about this and its importance, essentially?
I mean, the Care Act applies to all of us who are over the age of 18. Doesn't necessarily mean that we'll need it now, but there might be a time when we do need it. And it's really important that we all understand that it's there and what its purpose is. And that's quite a broad statement there, is, protecting people's right to live in safety free from abuse and neglect. And it takes people and organisations to work together to enable that to happen. And it can sort of be divided into two parts. We have that preventative measure, which is what we're talking about all this morning, is what steps can we put in place to prevent harm and abuse from happening in whatever settings it might be. And then it's the second part to that sadly, if it does happen, what response can we have? Where can we signpost to? What extra support can we bring in to prevent that abuse from continuing or further abuse from happening in the future? So it doesn't really matter where we are within sort of England. We all have that responsibility, and we all have a role to play to keep adults safe.
And you, Bethany?
Well, in order to support the intention behind the Care Act, DBS, we have written an awful lot of website guidance. So there's a full suite of eligibility guidance specifically. We've got workforce guidances that are documents that are broken down into those roles that work with children, those roles that work with adults, and those roles that don't necessarily work with either of those groups. And then access to standard checks as well. And it just breaks down the legislation into a more easily understandable set of language, so that organisations can establish where eligibility will exist for the correct level of check to support them in their safeguarding responsibilities. On the website, we also have sector-specific leaflets and guidance. So we have specific guidance about working with adults in the sports sector, working with adults in faith sectors, and we've got very specific guidance there to help organisations in those sectors establish what's appropriate and where to go for next steps.
And is it the same on your website, Cath? Is that, because I went on and had a little look, and is there quite a lot of resources on yours for this too?
Yes, on our website we've got a section which relates to the DBS and the information that you can find there. We also have further information about sort of the safe recruitment processes, as well as a whole range of different resources, from policy development to procedures, education, training. So anything to do with safeguarding adults, hopefully you'll find it.
Well, I will make sure they are all in our episode notes. Thank you, ladies. Thank you for your time, and thank you for listening. We really hope that our discussions has given you a deeper understanding around safeguarding working with adults. Thank you again to my guests, Bethany Culshaw, DBS Policy Advisor, and Cath Sykes from Anne Craft Trust. In our next episode, we'll be finding out how police consider disclosing information on certificates. I hope you found this episode useful and maybe even picked up some new information. Don't forget, there's a link to all the resources mentioned in the episode notes, and if you'd like a question answering around DBS or any part of the process, you'll find our email there too. Thanks for listening.